The sheriff handed me the eviction notice at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. 24 hours to vacate the mansion I'd paid for. My ex-husband stood on the lawn with his new wife, smiling like they'd just won the lottery. My 2 children wouldn't even look at me through the window. I had lost everything in a courtroom that didn't care about the truth. But 3 days later, while packing the attic, I found a dusty yellow envelope buried under old Christmas decorations. Inside were 3 photographs and a single piece of paper that would burn their perfect new life to the ground. If you've ever been lied about, cheated on, or watched someone steal what's rightfully yours while everyone believed their story instead of the truth, this one's for you. Hit that like button if you believe real justice isn't always served in a courtroom. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Also leave a comment where you are listening from because this story gets wild. And stick around until the very end, because the revenge I got wasn't just satisfying. It was absolutely perfect. But first, I would like you to grab a cup of coffee as we ride together into this story. My name is Autumn Blake. I'm 41 years old, and for 18 years I believed I was living the American dream. Big house in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina. 2 beautiful kids, Wesley, 16, and Iris, 13. A husband who kissed me goodbye every morning and told me I was his rock. That husband was Cameron Blake, a commercial real estate developer who drove a black Range Rover and wore watches that cost more than most people's cars. I wasn't always rich. I grew up in a trailer park in Gastonia, raised by a single mom who worked double shifts at the Waffle House just to keep the lights on. When I met Cameron at 23, I was waitressing at a steakhouse downtown, trying to save up for community college. He walked in wearing a suit that probably cost a month of my rent. He left me a $100 tip on a $30 steak and his business card with a note that said, "Dinner on me this time." I thought I'd won the lottery. We got married 10 months later. A small ceremony, just his parents and my mom. His mother, Constance, wore pearls and a tight smile that never reached her eyes. She pulled me aside during the reception and whispered, "You seem sweet, dear. Just remember my son is used to a certain standard." I should have heard the warning in those words. But I was 24, in love, and stupidly hopeful. The first few years were good. Cameron's business took off. We moved from a 2-bedroom condo into a 4,000-square-foot house with a 3-car garage and a pool. I got pregnant with Wesley, then Iris. I stopped working because Cameron insisted. "I make enough for both of us," he'd say. "Focus on the kids, make this house a home." So I did. I threw myself into being the perfect wife and mother. I organized his business dinners, remembered his clients' birthdays, and packed his lunches with handwritten notes. I drove the kids to soccer, piano, tutoring. I volunteered at their school. I made our house the kind of place people envied when they drove past it. But somewhere around year 12, Cameron changed. He started coming home later. His phone was always face down on the counter. He'd snap at me for small things, like folding his shirts wrong or asking about his day. When I'd try to kiss him, he'd turn his cheek. When I'd reach for his hand, he'd pull away. I told myself he was stressed. His company was expanding and he was traveling more. I made excuses because I didn't want to see the truth. The truth walked into my life on a Saturday afternoon in June. Her name was Skylar Brennan. She was 29 years old. Blonde hair that looked like it cost $500 to maintain. She worked in Cameron's office as his executive assistant. I'd met her twice at company events and thought nothing of it. She seemed polite, professional, and even boring. I found out about them by accident. Cameron had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping. I was just closing it to move it out of the way when I saw the message notification pop up on the screen. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. When can we do it again?" The sender was Skylar. My hands started shaking. I opened the message thread. Months of texts, photos I couldn't unsee, plans to meet at hotels, complaints about me. "She's so boring," one message read. "Always talking about the kids. I can't wait until this is over and we can finally be together." I threw up in the sink. When Cameron came home that night, I confronted him. I was crying so hard I could barely breathe. I showed him the messages. I begged him to explain. I asked him if he still loved me. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I haven't loved you in years, Autumn. I stayed because of the kids, but I'm done pretending." Just like that, 18 years, 2 children, a life I'd built with my own hands. Gone. I asked him to leave. He laughed. "Leave. This is my house, Autumn. I paid for it. You're the one who's going to leave." That's when the real nightmare started. 2 weeks later, Cameron filed for divorce. But it wasn't just divorce. He filed for full custody of Wesley and Iris. He claimed I was an unfit mother, that I had anger issues and had been emotionally abusive to him and the kids for years, that I'd threatened to hurt myself when he tried to leave. Every single word was a lie. But he had something I didn't. Money. Lots of it. And a lawyer named Paul Kirby who specialized in destroying women in family court. The custody hearings were brutal. Cameron sat there in his expensive suits, holding Skylar's hand, playing the role of the devoted father who'd suffered in silence for years. Skylar testified that she'd seen me scream at the kids, that I'd thrown things during arguments. Cameron had confided in her about how scared he was for his children's safety. My own children testified against me. Wesley stood up in that courtroom and said I'd been distant and angry ever since he could remember. Iris, my baby girl, cried and said she didn't feel safe living with me anymore. They'd been coached. I knew it, but I couldn't prove it. My lawyer was a public defender who barely looked at my file. I couldn't afford anyone better because Cameron had frozen all our joint accounts. I had $1,500 to my name and no job history in over a decade. The judge, an older man named Howard Finch, didn't even look at me when he read the verdict. Full custody to Cameron. I got supervised visitation twice a month. The house, the cars, the savings accounts, all of it went to him because he could prove he'd earned it. My name wasn't on anything. I'd been so trusting and stupid. I walked out of that courthouse with nothing. Cameron sold our house 2 weeks later, bought a bigger one across town. Moved Sculla in immediately, and my kids called her Mom within a month. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner in a part of town I used to drive past without looking. The walls were thin. The carpet smelled like cigarettes. I cried myself to sleep every night for 3 months straight. I thought my life was over. But then I found the envelope. The eviction notice came on a cold Tuesday in October. The landlord said I was 2 months behind on rent. I'd been using every dollar from my part-time job at Target just to eat and pay for the supervised visitation fees. I was drowning. I called my mom, sobbing. She wired me $300 she didn't have. It wasn't enough. I had nowhere to go. No friends left because they'd all believed Cumcrun's story. No family except my mom who lived in a studio apartment herself. So I did the only thing I could think of. I drove to the old house. The one Cumcrun and I had lived in before the big mansion. The one we'd kept as a rental property. It had been sitting empty for months, and I still had a key from years ago. I parked down the street and waited until dark. Then I let myself in through the back door. The place smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was covered in sheets, but it had a roof and it was warm. I slept on the couch that night, using my jacket as a blanket. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the dirty windows. I decided to clean up a little, make the place livable for a few days until I figured out my next move. That's when I went up to the attic. The attic was full of boxes we'd never unpacked from our first apartment. Old photo albums, college textbooks, Christmas decorations we'd replaced with fancier ones over the years. I was pulling down a box of ornaments when I saw it. A yellow envelope tucked behind a stack of Cumcrun's old business files. It was dusty, the edges worn. There was no label on it. I opened it. Inside were 3 photographs and a single sheet of paper. The first photograph was of Cumcrun. He looked younger, maybe 25. He was standing in front of a small office building I didn't recognize. He was smiling, holding a set of keys. The second photograph was of Cumcrun with another man. Older, gray hair, expensive suit. They were shaking hands in front of the same building. The third photograph made my stomach drop. It was a check, made out to Cumcrun Blake for $500,000. The signature at the bottom belonged to the older man in the second photo. The memo line read, "Investment Westwood Plaza Project." The paper was a contract, a partnership agreement between Cumcrun Blake and the older man, whose name was printed at the top, Franklin Mercer. I knew that name. Everyone in Charlotte knew that name. Franklin Mercer was a real estate mogul who'd been arrested 8 years ago for fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He died in prison 2 years later. The contract was dated 20 years ago, long before I met Cumcrun. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding harder each time. According to the contract, Franklin Mercer had given Cumcrun $500,000 to invest in a commercial property deal called the Westwood Plaza Project. In exchange, Mercer would receive 60% of all profits from the project. But here's the thing. The Westwood Plaza Project was Cumcrun's big break. The deal that launched his entire career. The project that made him millions. Cumcrun had always told me he'd scraped together his own money to buy that property, that he'd worked 3 jobs and saved every penny, that he was a self-made man. He'd lied. He'd used Franklin Mercer's money that came from fraud, and when Mercer got arrested, Cumcrun had kept everything. He'd never paid Mercer back. He'd never honored the partnership agreement. Mercer had died in prison, and Cumcrun had walked away with millions of dollars that didn't belong to him. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the envelope. I sat down on the dusty attic floor and just stared at the photographs. This was it. This was the truth Cumcrun had buried, the secret he'd built his entire empire on, and I had proof. I took the envelope and drove straight to the public library. I spent the next 6 hours on the computer, searching for everything I could find about Franklin Mercer. I found his obituary. He'd left behind a wife named Lorraine and 2 adult daughters, Punna and Zai. Lorraine still lived in Charlotte. I found her address in the phone book. I sat in my car outside the library for an hour, staring at the envelope. Part of me wanted to burn it, to forget I'd ever seen it and just move on with my broken life. But then I thought about Cumcrun. About the way he'd looked at me in that courtroom. About the way my own children had been turned against me. About the way Sculla had smiled when the judge handed down the verdict. I thought about justice, and I decided I wasn't done fighting. I showed up at Lorraine Mercer's house on a Saturday morning. It was a modest 2-story in an older neighborhood. The lawn was neat, the paint was fresh, but it was nothing like the mansions her husband had once owned. I knocked on the door 3 times before she answered. Lorraine Mercer was in her 70s. Silver hair pulled back in a bun with tired eyes. She looked at me like she was used to people showing up with bad news. "Can I help you?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "My name is Autumn Blake. I was married to Cumcrun Blake. I think your husband had a business deal with him a long time ago." Her face changed. The tiredness was replaced with something sharp and angry. "Come in," she said. We sat in her living room. The walls were covered in family photos. Franklin in his younger days, smiling with his daughters. Lorraine on their wedding day. A life that had been destroyed by lies and greed. I handed her the envelope. She opened it slowly. Her hands trembled as she looked at the photographs and the contract. When she finished reading, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew Franklin didn't act alone. He told me before he died that someone had betrayed him, that someone had taken everything and left him to rot. But he wouldn't tell me who. He said it would put us in danger." "Cumcrun used your husband's money to start his business," I said. "He never paid him back. He let him go to prison and kept everything for himself." Lorraine's jaw tightened. "My daughters and I lost everything when Franklin was arrested. Our house, our savings, and our reputation. We've been living off Social Security and my part-time job at the church for 8 years. And you're telling me Cumcrun Blake has been living in a mansion with money that belonged to my husband?" "Yes," I said. She stood up and walked to the window. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she turned back to me. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I want to take him down," I said. "I want him to lose everything the way I did, the way you did, but I can't do it alone. I need your help." Lorraine sat back down. She looked at the contract again, then she looked at me. "What's your plan?" she asked. I smiled for the first time in months. "I'm going to give this contract to the FBI, fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. If Cameron used illegal money to start his business, everything he owns is built on a crime. They'll seize his assets, his accounts, and his properties." "And what about you?" Lorraine asked. "What do you get out of this?" "I get to watch him fall," I said, "and maybe, just maybe, my kids will finally see who their father really is." Lorraine was quiet for a moment, then she reached out and squeezed my hand. "Let's do it," she said. The next week was the most stressful of my life. Lorraine and I met with a lawyer who specialized in white-collar crime. His name was Jerome Cross, and he'd made a career out of going after rich men who thought they were untouchable. Jerome looked over the contract and the photographs. He made some calls and did some digging. Then he looked at me and said, "This is solid. If the FBI can prove Cameron used Mercer's money and never reported it, they can charge him with fraud and money laundering. Everything he owns could be seized under civil asset forfeiture." "How long will it take?" I asked. "Months," Jerome said. "Maybe a year. These cases move slowly, but I think we have a real shot." I didn't have a year, I didn't even have a month, but I nodded and said, "Let's do it." Jerome filed a formal complaint with the FBI. 2 weeks later, 2 agents showed up at my apartment. They asked me 100 questions. They took the envelope, the photographs, and the contract. They told me not to talk to anyone about the case. I waited. And while I waited, I did something else. I started documenting everything about Cameron and Skylar. Every time I saw them at the supervised visitations, I took notes. I recorded conversations. I noticed little things. The way Skylar talked to my kids. The way Cameron checked his phone constantly. The way Wesley looked tired all the time. I started asking Wesley and Iris careful questions. Not about me, about them and about school. About their new house and Skylar. And slowly, cracks started to show. Iris mentioned that Cameron and Skylar fought a lot. Skylar yelled when Cameron wasn't home. That she didn't like the way Skylar talked to her. Wesley admitted he missed our old house. That he didn't like his new school and he felt like Cameron was always working and never had time for him anymore. I didn't push. I just listened. And I waited for the right moment. That moment came 4 months later. The FBI showed up at Cameron's office on a Tuesday morning in March. 6 agents with badges and warrants. They walked past his secretary, past Skylar, straight into his corner office. I wasn't there, but Jerome called me an hour later and told me everything. They'd seized his computers, his files and his bank records. They'd frozen his accounts pending investigation. They'd put holds on all his properties, including the mansion he'd just bought. Cameron called me that night. It was the first time I'd heard his voice in months. "What did you do?" he screamed. "What the hell did you do, Autumn?" I let him yell. I let him call me names. I let him threaten to make sure I never saw my kids again. And then I said very calmly, "I gave the FBI proof that you built your entire business on stolen money. Money you took from a man who died in prison. Money that never belonged to you. Good luck explaining that to a judge." He hung up. 2 weeks later, the story broke. Local news first, then national. Charlotte developer under investigation for fraud and money laundering. Cameron's face was on every channel. The details were vague, but the damage was done. His clients started pulling out. His business partners distanced themselves. The bank called in his loans. Skylar left him 3 weeks after the FBI raid. I heard through Jerome that she'd moved back to her parents' house in Florida. She'd posted something on social media about toxic relationships and finding herself. The irony was delicious. But the best part, the part that made all of it worth it, came 2 months later. Wesley called me. Not during a supervised visit, just a regular call on a Thursday night. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking. "Can I come stay with you?" I almost dropped the phone. "What, Wesley, what's going on?" "Dad's losing it," he said. "He's been drinking every night. He yells at me and Iris for no reason. The house is going to be taken by the bank. I don't want to be here anymore. I want to come home." I drove to Cameron's house that night. I knocked on the door. Cameron answered, and he looked terrible. Unshaven, bloodshot eyes. His expensive suit was wrinkled. "They want to come with me," I said. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. Wesley and Iris were waiting in the hallway with their backpacks already packed. Iris ran to me and hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. "I'm sorry, Mommy," she whispered. "I'm so sorry," I cried, right there in Cameron's doorway. I cried and held my children and didn't let go. Cameron didn't say a word. He just closed the door. 3 months later, the FBI formally charged Cameron with fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The trial was set for the following year. His lawyers were fighting, but Jerome said it didn't look good for him. The mansion was seized. The cars were sold at auction. Cameron moved into a condo his parents were renting for him. Lorraine Mercer and her daughters received a settlement from the civil case. Not everything they'd lost, but enough to help them rebuild. And me, I got my kids back. We moved into a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Wesley started seeing a therapist to work through everything he'd been told about me. Iris asked if we could bake cookies together like we used to. I said yes and cried happy tears while we rolled out the dough. I got a better job, an office manager position at a nonprofit. It didn't pay much, but it was stable. It was mine. And every single night I tucked my kids into bed, kissed their foreheads, and thanked God for that dusty yellow envelope. Cameron's trial is next month. I plan to be there. Not because I want to see him suffer, but because I want him to see that I survived, that I rebuilt and I won. The truth is, revenge isn't always loud and dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just finding the one piece of evidence that unravels everything. Sometimes it's watching karma finally catch up to the people who thought they were untouchable. I didn't destroy Cameron. He destroyed himself the moment he decided to build his life on lies. I just made sure the truth came out. If this story hits you hard, smash that like button and let me know in the comments if you think Autumn did the right thing. Should she have walked away, or was she justified in bringing Cameron down? Subscribe for more stories about people who refused to be victims and fought back against the ones who wronged them. Justice isn't always served in a courtroom, but sometimes it finds a way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.